Chapter 16. Hunted. Once the group got back to camp, Talmer left to hunt as Caliph wandered off to grab herbs and edible roots. The others began doing small chores around the camp as he slipped into the trees. He made sure his bow was strung and ready as he looked for signs of animals hiding in the trees. The whispering of the wind in the autumn leaves called a faint piece of memory back to him. At first, he thought it would be a painful memory, but then he realized that it was just a flash of one of the times he'd been hunting with his brother. His brother, Mirel, had been teaching him to track the small animals living in the forests near their woodland home. After a few seconds, he realized that the memory was from the day he'd gotten his first kill. He smiled slightly, remembering the proud grin on Mirel's face. Remembering all the tricks he had been taught, he continued through the forest, knowing it would be difficult to find anything in cold, late autumn weather. He found a few squirrels and a scrappy vole, but nothing worth shooting. The sun was creeping higher. He moved through the forest, keeping a wary eye out for direwolves and other predators. He eventually found a rabbit, but it was too fast to get a clean shot. He continued searching for tracks, but found nothing worthwhile. The sun was high in the sky by the time Talmer found the tracks he was looking for. He followed them into a field where deer were grazing. Their light tan coats stood out a bit in the grass, which was crisscrossed with their trails. The grass was tall enough to completely conceal him as he crept through, trying to get a clean shot. He could tell by the deer's thin frames and graceful spiraling antlers that they were Lightfoot deer, a small, agile species that was usually considered a delicacy. He knew that in some parts of Kaldur, the law prevented anyone but nobles from hunting them, but if no one found out, he didn't think there would be any problems. A cold wind blew, rustling branches and startling the deer. Their heads perked up and they turned to run. Knowing it was almost too late, Talmer took his shot, bringing down a buck. The rest scattered and Talmer started through the grass to collect his prize. He had just retrieved his arrow when something large came crashing through the bushes. Turning, he once again found himself facing a dire wolf. This one was larger than the last one he'd fought, the size of a horse and much more aggressive. It charged, jaws snapping. He managed to avoid getting his head bitten off, but the wolf bowled him over, knocking him on his back in the grass. It stood over him, snarling, front feet planted on his chest. He felt something crack, and he suspected the creature's weight had broken at least one of his already damaged ribs. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even get to his knife. A shout rang out across the field, and the wolf's head turned, looking for the source of the sound. Suddenly, it leapt off him, sprinting across the field, only to fall with a dwarvish axe in its head. Baodin crossed the field and stood over Talmer, giving him a scornful glance. "Didn't think I'd be the one to save you, eh, elf?" he asked, his hands on his hips. "Wouldn't do to let our hunter get eaten." "Oh, thank you." Talmer pushed himself up, clutching his injured ribs. He grabbed the buck he'd shot by the antlers and began to drag it. Baodin retrieved his axe. "I can't believe I just saved him," Baodin muttered to himself, just loud enough for Talmer to hear. He followed, a bit reluctantly, letting the elf find their way back to camp. Vala hoped that Talmer would have better luck than she would. To her, the woods looked deserted, but she wasn't the hunter, which was why she'd stayed in camp. She wasn't much help here either, though. The other two were doing all the work. They had assured her that it was fine, but she still felt a little bit useless. Currently, Damien, with a bit of help from Varun, was dragging a pot full of water over to the fire. "How do you even carry that thing?" Vala asked once they'd gotten it balanced on the logs. "This? I'll show you." Damien ran over to the base of the tree where all their gear had been dropped and grabbed his bag. "Look inside." He tossed it to her. It was much lighter than she would have expected, weighing 15 pounds at most. She pulled it open and found a semi-organized mess of supplies, but the interior of the bag looked much larger than the exterior would allow. "It's 3 times as big on the inside." Damien explained proudly. Cost me quite a bit, but it only weighs a fraction of what it should. She tossed it back to him just as Talmer and Baodin pushed their way through the trees, dragging a buck. The wood elf dropped his kill on the ground and began field dressing it. He was quick, finishing his part in under 10 minutes and letting Damien take over while he went to dispose of the scraps. The buck was small and bony, about the size of a large dog, but it would have enough meat to last for a few days. Damien snatched Talmer's knife and began to carve it. The Thalassar glared at him, clearly getting a bit tired of being the only one with a knife when everyone needed it, but he let it slide. Vala saw him glance over at Varun and noticed a dagger on the Thrakai's belt, but she guessed that no one had any intention of grabbing it from him. She was almost certain that he'd let someone else use it if they asked, but Damien didn't seem interested in asking. Caliph was nowhere to be seen, still off gathering edible plants from the forest. A howl filled the air, long and chilling. It was far enough away that it probably wouldn't attack the camp, but it was still concerning. Direwolf, Varun noted, identifying the source of the howl. Shouldn't be a problem, Baodin said, inspecting the blade of his axe. If it comes too close, we'll take it out. Calith's out there alone and practically unarmed, Damien pointed out. If it finds her, she won't be able to fight it off. Talmer, can you track her? Which way did she go? Talmer leapt to his feet, a worried look in his green eyes. She was following the river, Baodin pointed. She got out of sight a few minutes before I went to find you. So what you're saying is she's been gone for a while. Talmer picked up his bow, which he'd left leaning against the tree. Let's not waste any more time. Varun, sit back down. You're hurt. You stay here and guard Damien, Baodin ordered as the Thrakai stood up. The dwarf was attempting to take charge. If we're going to split up, someone's got to babysit the human. Besides, you always act like you can take down an army, so you can probably handle him for a little while. Hey, Damien protested, I'm standing right here. Another howl split the air, closer this time. Talmer, Vala, and Baodin sprinted into the forest. Pretty soon, they made their way to the creek. It was about 8 feet across and not very deep, but Vala had learned the hard way how cold it was. Talmer leapt over the water, landing on a rock in the middle of the creek. Baodin followed, nearly falling in. Once he made it across, it was Vala's turn. She leapt onto the rock, nearly slipping on the slick surface. She flailed, losing her balance. Talmer caught her wrist, pulling her to the shore and holding her close to steady her. In different circumstances, it may have been seen as a romantic gesture, but Talmer was obviously not interested in her in that way. His mind was set on finding Caliph. Not waiting for thanks, he ran on, following tracks Vala couldn't see. They ran for about half an hour, and Baodin was panting by the time Talmer slowed the pace. She should be close, he said, slightly out of breath himself. Her trail leads this way. She didn't have too much of a lead on us, and she would not have been running. Baodin grabbed his war horn from his belt and blew it. Its deep, resonant tone sent shivers up Vala's spine. A direwolf's howl answered, not the response they wanted. After a moment, a branch snapped and the trio spun, weapons drawn. Caliph stepped out of the bushes. There were leaves in her dark hair and her maroon tunic stained with dirt. She held a bag filled with her findings. We should get back, she warned. I think that horn call drew them this way. Branches snapped, and another howl rang out directly behind them this time. A direwolf stepped out of the bushes, ridden by a bloodborn hybrid. He appeared to be an orc, but his golden eyes, fanged grin, and the gray fur that grew on parts of his body led Vala to guess he was part wolf. 3 other full-blooded orcs stepped out of the bushes surrounding the group. Look what we caught, boys, the wolf rider laughed. Let's have some fun with them. The orcs circled around, drawing weapons. Talmer and Caliph snapped their bows up, knocking arrows. Baodin hefted his axe, and Vala drew her sword. The orcs closed in, and the group attacked. Vala went straight for their leader, dodging the attacks of his mount. It nearly got her leg, but she kicked it in the muzzle before it could bite her, and it jerked its head back. Rolling onto the wolf's head, she slashed her sword upwards, cleaving into its neck. It fell, spilling its rider to the ground. His sword was trapped under him, rendering him defenseless. That would have probably stopped Varun or Talmer from killing him, but Vala didn't care. She knew that if she let him get his blade, he would be able to overpower her easily out of physical strength alone. With one quick sweep, she sliced her sword through his throat. She turned, ready to take on another orc, but the rest had already been killed. "Let's get back to camp before more show up," Kalith said. "If they found us here, they may have gotten to Varun and Damien." Talmer nodded, turning to lead the way back. More orcs began crashing through the bushes just out of sight, and they ran, trying to lose them in the trees. Varun poked the fire with a small stick, coaxing the flames a bit higher. Damien stood, setting his lute on the ground, and stretched his arms above his head, glancing around the clearing. Varun thought he heard something moving in the forest, but he ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. He broke the stick in half and began feeding the pieces to the flames. He saw something move out of the corner of his eye, and turned as he realized with a start that it was an orc. The orc had his bow raised and was aiming at Damien, who was stirring the pot again. Varun lunged, throwing the human to the ground as the archer fired. The arrow glanced off his armor and disappeared into the bushes. 2 Bloodborn charged out of the trees. One threw a small knife aiming at Varun, but it missed wildly. The Thrakai readied his greatsword, watching them carefully to see what they were about to do. He was still hurt from the last few fights, and moving was no fun at all, but this was at least something to do. He stood over Damien, who he had hit a bit harder than he'd planned, ready to fend off anything that came near. The Bloodborn who'd thrown the knife pulled 2 more from the hidden sheaths in his armor. The other twirled a spear like a quarterstaff and leveled it at Varun. He charged, locking the shaft of his spear with the Thrakai's greatsword, providing an opening for his companion. Realizing the spear was aimed at his chest, not his head, Varun pulled his blade back and let the spear strike him. Its point scratched off his armor but didn't do any real damage. The hybrid was caught off guard by the move, and Varun landed a hit. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but the hybrid jumped back, cursing, and jabbed with the spear again. Varun managed to deflect it, but he knew they couldn't keep missing forever. The other threw another knife at him. He ducked, but the knife caught the scaled ridge above his eye. Blood began to trickle down his face, but he blinked it out of his eye, continuing to fight as the spear wielder attacked again. Damien began to get up, but Varun shot him a look and he rethought it, staying on the ground. Varun nearly tripped on him, but he'd rather the human stay there where he could defend him instead of trying to join the fight. Another knife glanced off Varun's armor, followed by an arrow nearly missing his head. Varun brought his sword down on the Bloodborn, but he raised his spear, letting the steel-plated shaft absorb the hit. Knowing that either the knife-thrower or the archer would soon score a hit, Varun grabbed the spear as the Bloodborn struck at him again and twisted it out of his grip. With his greatsword in his offhand, he threw the spear at the orc archer, pinning his corpse to a tree. He turned back to his now unarmed opponent. The Bloodborn ripped off his helmet and threw it at Varun. It hit him in the face. Varun heard Damien trying to suppress a laugh, but he ignored the human and focused on his foe. The man he was facing had once been human, but had been enhanced with dragon blood. Varun noticed that the scales circling his neck were an interlocking pattern of silver and gold, but he didn't have time to think about it. The other flung another knife, missing again, and Varun shot a jet of flame at him, willing to risk causing a bit of collateral damage to nearby trees. He screeched, trying desperately to smother the flames, and Varun turned back to the dragon hybrid. The defiant Bloodborn's pale eyes began to glow, and he smiled, then blew his own jet of flame. The Thrakai let the flames wash over him, knowing his scales and gear were resistant to fire. The Bloodborn's fire suddenly changed to ice, startling Varun. The ice wasn't very powerful, but it would have an effect if he kept up his attack for very long. Varun rushed him, about to strike with his greatsword, when an arrow pierced the Bloodborn's throat, breaking through the scales. Talmer charged out of the forest, leading the others. They immediately turned back to the trees, bracing for an attack. "What's going on?" Varun asked. "Orcs," Talmer panted. I don't know how many. Can I get up now? Damien asked, still laying where Varun had thrown him. Get a weapon and stay out of the way, Varun ordered. Whatever you do, don't die. Oh, yeah, great advice, Damien said sarcastically, pulling the spear out of the tree and the orc archer and running back. Why didn't I? Look out! Orcs emerged from the trees, hesitating slightly when they saw the dead Bloodborn. They killed the elites, the smallest one of them called. We're dead. Yeah, you are, Baodin said, giving them a bloodthirsty grin. Who's first? The dwarf charged at them, swinging his axe. Varun and Damien followed him. Vala disappeared, but the rest of the group was too busy to notice. Baodin hacked at the orcs, slicing at their legs and leaving it up to the others to finish them off. Damien had taken a liking to the spear and was using it to take out the orcs without suffering a scratch. Since her allies were too close to the enemy for her to effectively use her bow, Caliph had taken Damien's rapier and charged into the fray. Soon, only 2 orcs were left. They scooted closer to each other, weapons held defensively, giving Vala the perfect opportunity. Varun and Baodin turned to them, ready to attack, but they suddenly fell to the ground, dead. Vala stepped out of the trees, holding a pair of bloody daggers. She flipped one in the air and caught it effortlessly, feeling quite happy with her kills. Behind the group, near the center of the clearing, something shifted. They all turned, braced for an attack. The Bloodborn who had been torched had pushed himself up on his elbows. His armor was charred and blackened, but he was still alive, although barely. The Bloodborn will rise, he croaked. We have already won. There's nothing you can do to stop it. We will cleanse this world, make it strong again. The Bloodborn will rise. His voice trailed off into a soft sigh as he slumped to the ground again. Vala was almost certain he was dead, but she drove her dagger through his chest anyway. The burned, now brittle armor cracked easily. Okay, this needs to stop, Varun said. I don't know what he meant by cleanse, but I've got a bad feeling about it. Me too, Caliph said, stepping over one of the dead orcs. There are 6 of us, and probably hundreds of them, Talmer said, giving Varun a look. I know what you're thinking, and no, we are not storming their compound. I wasn't going to suggest that. Varun cast a quick glance at the surrounding tree line before putting his sword away. I like that idea, Baodin argued. Varun already proved that it's possible to get out of there alive, and besides, it's payback. They attack our camp, we attack their compound. It's a huge fortress, Vala said. We don't even know where to find Zarloth, even if we make it past the front gates alive. We could go in quietly, Varun suggested. Through the front door? Vala raised an eyebrow at him. You really think that's going to work? No. There might be a tunnel or back door, or even just a cellar we can go through, Varun explained. If we can get through a back door and avoid the main room, we should be able to make it through without alerting anyone. Then what? We bypass the guards but still have to face the soldiers inside? Vala asked. Besides, we already know the only way in is through the main doors. What's this? Damien asked. Both Bloodborn have one. They turned to him. He held up an intricate black choker that Vala recognized. A circular blood-red ruby held in a black-wire diamond that was encircled by a ring of black wire. All the Bloodborn had worn one, save Zarloth and Arian. Just some trinket, probably, Caliph said. It's probably their symbol or something, Vala mused. If all of them wear one, it should be easier to recognize them even if they're disguised. So, when do we storm the compound? Baodin asked, rubbing his hands together eagerly. It's been a while since I had a real challenge, and this axe needs some use. Your people have a problem with that, Talmer muttered. An axe is always the solution to everything. What did you just say, Elf? Beodin growled. You heard me. An axe might be a good solution to you if you keep talking like that, the dwarf threatened. Like it was to my brother. I didn't throw that one. But I'm starting to think the more you Thalis are who catch the sharp end of an axe, the better.
Hey, this isn't helping,
Kalith snapped, silver eyes blazing.
Look, we all had family problems, okay? Why do you think we're out here, putting our lives on the line when, if things were different, we could all be at home with our families and loved ones? Vala's mother exiled her and tried to have her killed. My parents were murdered. Varun's clan was destroyed by someone he thought was a friend. Damien, I guess Damien's the only one whose family is still alive and doesn't hate him, but you should be able to get my point. It doesn't matter. We all have issues with each other, and bringing up the past doesn't help. Talmer, I know that you feel like Beodin's responsible for your brother's death, but he's not. He wasn't the one who threw the axe. Beodin, it was the Wood Elves king who kicked your family off his land. Talmer had nothing to do with it. I know how you feel. Every time I look at Vala, I'm reminded of the monsters who killed my parents, but she's not the one who did it. I know we all have a lot of bad memories, and it doesn't help that your parents are intertwined. But if we want to survive the next 24 hours, we need to shut up about the past and work together. This isn't how any of us expected life to go. Most of us should have grown up to be leaders or rulers, but we were driven out. I guess that shows that being a noble has more risks than rewards. Again, Damien's the only one here who didn't lose everything. We were either kicked out or ran away. We're all running away. Right now, we need to take a stand. The Bloodborn aren't something we can forget about. They're going to keep growing stronger unless someone does something. That someone has to be us. We have to fight, and we have to win this, and the only way we can do that is if we stop fighting each other. Absolute silence fell as everyone sat staring at Kalith. The only sounds were the wind in the branches and the burble of the creek. Vala glanced around, knowing that only Kalith knew the full truth of her past, and hoping that none of the others brought it up. Can we, hold off on another battle, at least until the food's done? Damien asked, finally breaking the silence. Seriously, I don't think any of you have eaten since yesterday, or longer. If we're going to get ourselves killed, we may as well eat first. I like that idea, Kalith agreed. Maybe then everyone will be able to talk this out like adults. Varun and Beodin began discussing how to dispose of the bodies while the rest of the group sat around the fire. The temperature had started to drop again as the storm began to brew on the horizon. Kalith slipped off into the woods to change into her winter gear. Talmer and Vala pulled their warm fur cloaks out of their bags. Some time while Vala had been gone, Damien had changed into a fur-lined tunic and fur-top boots. It was still warm enough that the cold didn't feel like it could be dangerous, but it was an annoyance. Vala began cleaning her weapons, waiting for the food to be done.
"Where are the others?" Zarloth snapped, getting in Arian's face. "And why are you the first one back?"
Arian didn't flinch, but Phelim was fairly sure he was nervous. "We've been searching all night, sir," Arian responded, his voice betraying nothing. "We covered the whole section of forest, but we found nothing. I told you where the camp was, but you insisted on sending me and my team to an entirely different section of forest. I know they may have moved their camp, but wouldn't it make more sense to send my group to the last place they were?"
"I sent Rock and his orcs to that section of land," Zarloth said, starting to get annoyed. You and your team are much stealthier, so you were sent to a different section in case our targets were somehow smart enough to move camp once they were found."
"I understand that, and I did my job," Arian said, an edge creeping into his voice. "It's almost midday, and my team has been working for more than a day without rest, so I told them to come back after we did a sweep of the forest. We did our job."
"Failure," Zarloth muttered, turning away. "Even if you found nothing, there's no reason for your team to be the first to return. Your group had the largest section of land to patrol, and you still finished first. Let's hope Ruck and the elites can perform better than you."
Phelan saw Arian bite his lip, holding back a comment that would probably make Zarloth lash out. Zarloth paced back and forth across the small room, his quiet anger somehow even more intimidating than if he had been yelling. Arian's elites stood near the wall next to Mira, trying to stay out of the way. The assassins were nowhere to be seen. Phelan glanced at Arian again, impressed that the Tauren could stay so still and calm. Arian stood with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for Zarloth's orders or for a slap. Suddenly, the door opened, and the elite who Zarloth had yelled at ran in. He saluted, ducking his head to the Tauren.
"My group found nothing, sir,"
he said, pulling off his helmet.
"If they're not in the forest, we should send a team to Falthalis."
"No," Zarloth said. "We already have men there, and their mission cannot be compromised in any way. Besides, Arian followed our fugitives through Falthalis before they broke in. He was careless and may have been seen last time, so our targets will be on high alert if they go back to that town. Our Ironforge team should return soon, but their mission was not essential. Once Ruck gets back, we can discuss our plan."
"Ruck's not coming back," the elite said, wincing. "I found his body in the forest."
"And you somehow failed to find the ones that killed him?"
"Sir, we searched around that whole area. There was no sign pointing to where they went."
"I would think you would at least be able to find something," Zarloth growled. "A sign of who killed him, at least."
"No, sir," the elite bowed his head. "I heard a commotion in their section, so I went to investigate. When I got there were only bodies. I did find that not all of his group were there, though. Just him and 3 others, and 2 of them had been shot. His mount was killed, too. I assume it's our fugitives, but other than the arrows, no sign of the killers."
"Understood, elite. You're dismissed," Zarloth spat. "Get out of here."
"Sir," one of Arian's elites spoke up, "what should we do?"
"You should shut up and wait until you're spoken to," Zarloth snapped. "Arian, go, and take your bunch of rabble with you."
Wordlessly, Arian turned on his heel and left the room, gesturing to the rest to follow him.